Welcome everyone to this 14th session of Global Habitat Seminar. Today we will have the presentation of Dr. Davide Luca. Dr. Davide Luca is assistant professor in applied economics and political policy at University of Cambridge. Before joining Cambridge, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Kennedy School of Government and worked for the European Commission. And he holds a PhD in economic geography from the London School of Economics, where he is currently visiting fellow. He will be presenting his latest research on urban political polarization and economic development around the world. We expect to have a very interesting conversation and very connected with the current presidential elections that we are having in Chile. The transmission will be fully in English, but it will become available in Spanish on YouTube. Just you have to select the Spanish subtitles. And you can Spanish or in English, either if you are in the Zoom session, you can ask them on the chat. And if you are on Facebook, you can leave your comments in both languages, and we will ask Davide your questions. So Davide, welcome to the Institute of Housing. For us, it's an honor to have you here. And without further introduction, you can start presenting for 30 minutes, and then we will another 30 minutes.
Hi, Pablo. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Unfortunately, I can't speak Spanish, so I will present in English, but I'll be happy to answer any questions and later on. So, as by the introduction anticipated, today I'm going to present work on the links between somehow political discontent, urban-rural polarization, and progressive values around the world. What I'm going to present is joint work with Javier, who is actually in the audience, or he may jump in during the Q&A, and we're also with Jonas Stein and Nili from the London School of Economics and the University of Norway. And let me start with some stylized facts. The reason, the starting point for this paper, so for the piece of research that I'm discussing about today, is the fact that commentators, especially in the last years, have highlighted how there might be a growing urban-rural gap around the world. For example, this is the piece you are seeing. It's a headline from the New York Times, focusing on the US, and it was identifying the urban-rural divide as the new political fault line in America. Similar stories in other newspapers. For example, if we read the lower one by the Financial Times, was even claiming that the urban-rural split, so the political divisions between the big cities and then the countryside, have become a great global divide, not only characterizing the US. Perhaps interesting cases come from France. France, in fact, is an exemplary case. And if any of you, I understand it might be far away from the politics in Chile, but if any of you follow international politics and follow the case of France in 2019 and the urban protest by the Gilets jaunes, may remember that this kind of protest was framed as a revolt of the countryside and the suburbs against the inner cities. France was a very paradigmatic case of political unrest framed into a urban versus the rest of the country narrative. Similar story for the US. I anticipated already that the US is a paradigmatic case, and in fact, if one looks at the election, and here I'm presenting the 2020 elections, the presidential election, you see that there is a massive divide between big cities and the rest of the country. In fact, there seems to be like a sort of big C of red counties where it's voting conservative, And then you see these big spots of democratic candidates, and those are the big cities. Interesting enough, in the case of the US, the relationship between a city size, so between big cities and political polarization or political support for a specific party is not something that has always existed, but in a way has developed over time. These are three graphs, so it's a combination of three charts from the Niskanen Institute, Niskanen Center, and what, as you can see, the relationship between or the correlation between a democratic political support and city size started to pick up in the 60s, not before. So overall, in a way, we see that there is growing evidence across Europe and North America that there are increasingly distinct factors in voting outcomes between urban and rural areas. The question is, does it hold for other places around the world? And this is the key question that we are trying to address in this paper. In fact, there is very little empirical evidence outside of Europe and North America. Similarly, and this is perhaps the second trigger, the second factor behind the motivation of our paper, is the fact that this divide, this political divide between big cities and the rest of countries and the countryside are frequently framed in terms of cultural values. Somehow this connects to there has been debate in political science on a shift between political cleavages. So, for example, the idea here is that the shifts that traditionally identified the left and the right of the political spectrum moving slowly from economic issues such as the role of the state in redistribution, being pro or less taxation, and this somehow this has shifted to a new or to some new political cleavages increasingly based on cultural values. This is, of course, also linked to the emergence of post-materialist values in the 60s and 70s, based, for example, on environmental issues, on gender rights, on minority rights, etc. And yet, again, there is little empirical work on these cultural values and on how on the geographies of these values outside of Europe and the US. So in a way, these are the kind of issues that we try to address in this project. So to sum up these first slides that I presented you, the two questions that we try to address in this paper are, the first one, is there a rural-urban, or if you want, an urban-rural gap in progressive values around the world? Question one. And question two, if so, does this gap differ in importance depending on the economic development of the country? Let me spend a few slides, the few 3 or 4 slides discussing the theoretical predictions behind our framework. And the first and foremost, so the way in which we address question one is that there might be some contextual, some urban specific unique effects leading to a gap in values between cities, or especially big cities, and the rest of countries. Of course, here may think about some contextual effects, that is to say, some unique factors, unique influence that city may have on citizens and on views, for example, linked to interaction with people, getting in touch with diversity, and hence fostering a sense of like a more progressive values among the city dwellers. But of course, one could also think about composition effects. For example, there are people such as Russell Maxwell, in an interesting paper from 2 years ago, was arguing that cities or people in cities seem to be more progressive, but this is just an effect of composition. That is to say, cities attract younger and more educated people, and usually these tend to be more progressive. And so the level of higher progressivity in values that we see in cities is simply an artifact of a composition effect. Equally, there is the one we posit that divides in values between city and the countryside, which importantly we will try to explore whether they are contextual. So the contextual effects is our main hypothesis. One. Equally, one could think that the divide, the potential divide between cities and the countryside may be or may become more apparent at higher levels of economic development. And here I hope not to be it could be this issue could be challenged, but basically we draw on sort of modernization theory and on the work of authors such as Ronald Inglehart, who has been working a lot on the application of modernization theory to cultural studies and sociology. And here, perhaps one of the two main reasons why we may expect cities or we may expect progressive values to be stronger in context where there is a higher level of economic development relates to what is called the scarcity hypothesis. And here, as Inglehart suggests, in order to progressive value to develop, people first need to have their most pressing needs dealt with. This may sound familiar and obvious to many of us. In fact, one of his quotes is from a relatively recent book from around 20 years ago, is that the possibility of taking survival for granted brings cultural changes that make individual autonomy, gender equality, and democracy increasingly likely, giving rise to a new type of society that promotes human emancipation on many fronts. This is what was called, in a way, by Ron Inglehart in his very famous 1977 book, The Silent Revolution. Equally important is the idea, along with the scarcity hypothesis, is the idea that there is a socialization effect. So in a way, the rise of post-materialist values may take time to develop, but nevertheless, eventually, when economic development kicks in, so when people feel safe and feel that their basic needs are satisfied, start to embrace their views, and this will lead to the spread of progressive values. Important to stress, this kind of theories by Ron Inglehart doesn't focus on cities, so it's a sort of a cross-country type of analysis. And here is where we somehow feel we are making a theoretical contribution, because we say if this hypothesis is correct, it is in cities that we may see the effects. Cities are the places, the hubs, where diversity meets, where interaction happens, and where different attitudes and groups come together. And so this is where the place where individual people are more likely to modify their attitudes over time. Similar, authors such as Alice Evans, for example, focusing on gender studies, she comes up with a relatively similar theory, and she argues that cities also provide better chances for organization, for groups, for underrepresented groups. And so, for example, if we think about gender rights, in cities, groups that have better chances to organize and so to collectively push for change, and this in turn leads to more progressive, to the advancement of progressive values. Now, so far, I have said that I've highlighted how we draw on modernization theory. I have to say a cautionary note in a way. I don't want to sound too naive. I don't want to sound too oversimplistic. In fact, I would say let's be very cautious about oversimplistic or deterministic versions of modernization theory. In fact, here I'm showing you a picture of a famous painting by an American painter called American Progress, where everything it's a deterministic and very naive view of progress pushing against everything else. This is not what we have in mind. In a sense, in fact, in the last decades, lots of critical scholars have highlighted how cities are not always the sources of good. And any of you who may be from a urban studies background may know this kind of literature very well, and perhaps better than me and my co-authors. Similarly, there is always substantial heterogeneity across countries. So cities may be better in one country, may be worse in others, etc., etc. Equally, and last but not least, modernization may go in reverse. In fact, for example, Ingerhart and Norris in a book from 2017 were arguing that the increasing inequalities and decline of opportunities in many formerly affluent places have led to a sort of modernization in reverse, so with people becoming more conservative, becoming more open to diversity, more reactionary, etc. And they were linking this to the rise of populism. Perhaps in the Q&A, I will be curious to hear other theoretical suggestions on this, on how we may be cautious in our application of modernization theory. Nevertheless, overall, this is our framework, and I hope to convince you in the next empirical slides. So, what we do empirically? We combine data sets from the World Value Survey and the European Value Studies. Overall, this allows us to focus on the 66 countries for the period for the time span 2017-2021. And we are also able to identify or to have countries or individual respondents in countries at different levels of development. So overall, we have around 90,000 observations from high-income countries, upper middle, and lower or lower middle income countries. Just to give you an idea, this is the kind of the list of countries that we have. And since we are presenting in Chile, you see that Chile is part of the sample, of our sample. And in this slide, we equally highlight other South American countries for which I will later on show you some specific results. So what do we do empirically? For those of you who know statistics, a bit of statistics, you will recognize this very easily. If you don't worry. This equation is very simple. It's just to say that we have individual level data. So we run some regressions at the individual level. So for each individuals, living in country C, so I living in country C, we do the simple full cross-section of OLS, if you're familiar with what I mean. And what we connect, we regress is basically individual outcomes or progressive values, and I will come back later to our outcome, to an indicator, which is the U in red in this equation, which relates to the place of residence. So we try to see whether the place of residence is linked to individual progressive values. Of course, controlling, so netting out any potential confounding effects linked to country idiosyncrasies. In fact, we include country fixed effects, obviously, as well as factors such as age, gender, education, income, employment status, being an immigrant or a native, and life satisfaction. Technically, we do an OLS, but we also control for order logic. There is no difference. We, of course, include a survey, post-stratification weights, etc., etc. And I'm happy to come back to technicalities later on. Here, of course, our variable of interest, our explanatory variable of interest is a place of residence, which is our U in red. And our data sets allow us to, unfortunately, we don't have perfect data on where people are living, but we know whether they live in a very small place, below 5,000 inhabitants, in a small town, in a medium town, or in a large city, which is a city is over 100,000 inhabitants. And here we group very large cities, over 500,000 inhabitants in these categories, because many countries don't have larger cities. Alternatively, as a robustness, you may think that this is a very crude definition of cities versus the countryside. One could think about very more nuanced ways to measure what an urban place is. And to address this potential concern, we try to do an alternative robustness check using the Global Human Settlement Data Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Basically, it's a classification based on satellite imagery, where each dot of, I think, 1 kilometer, each grid on the planet by 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, is identified as being as whether it is a sort of urban area or not. So in a way, it's a finer grade identification with respect to these 5 categories. As I can anticipate, the results will be very similar. In terms of outcomes, which is the important part of our analysis, of course, we develop an index of progressive values, and in so doing, we build on the work by Ron Ingerhardt, who was highlighting how progressive values are values with a greater tolerance for ethnic, cultural, and sexual diversity, and individual choice concerning the kind of life that one wants to live. So to cut it short, we have data for the following variables. So tolerance to factors such as abortion, homosexuality, prostitution, divorce, euthanasia, and casual sex, gender equality, men make better politicians, men are better doing business, and finally, values towards immigration. So the questions are, jobs should be prioritized for nationals, or what is the impact of immigration on the development of your country? Effectively, we combine all these variables together, and we develop an overall index of progressive value. At the end, our index goes from 1 to 10. 10 is the highest level, and this is the kind of picture that we get if we plot or if we map our index across the world. Of course, one may think that these are very different dimensions, and in fact, we will show how the analysis, how the results compare and score when we analyze these different dimensions separately, but the difference is not that big. Similarly, here we plot the gap between urban and rural places in progressive values. And on the bottom, on the lower corner, we plot the correlation between this gap between the cities and the countryside and GDP, individual GDP per capita. And overall, there seemed to be a sort of general correlation between richer countries or and higher urban-rural gap. But let's jump to the results. It's time for the results. These are the regression coefficients and we report only the coefficients for our main variable of interest, which is a place of residence. Of course, we include all the other controls, as you can see in the lower part of the table. If you're not familiar with quantitative results, effectively, these numbers are telling us that there is a statistically significant difference between the average individual living in a big city and the average individual living in the other categories. The results equally tell us that there is a strong and significant difference between people living in these different settings. In fact, a person living in a rural area tends to have significantly less progressive value or a less progressive index with respect to a Importantly, the gap decreases, so the gap between big cities and the rest of the countries decrease after the inclusion of controls. So this tells us that there is indeed some sort of composition effect, so that the overall gross differences that we see between different places are in part explained by composition effects. That is to say, by the fact that cities probably host people who tend to be more highly educated, etc., etc. And these are the factors then affecting the gross differences in results. But nevertheless, there also seem to be a sort of an effect, a contextual effect of cities in influencing attitudes and progressive values. Just to give you an idea, if we were to unpack our progressive value index in the higher upper left hand side of the graph into its three different components, we see that the biggest difference is in family values, while for the two other categories it's less pronounced, but still it's there as anticipated. Importantly, equally so, what may these results tell us in real terms, if one is curious about the implication of our results? And to provide a bit of food for thought, in this graph we plot how the differences in progressive values are explained by the place of residence, our main variable of interest, and here it's the first variables at the top, compared to other important determinants of our progressive values. And you see that the distance between let's say, the most urban and the most rural dweller is smaller than other categories, smaller, for example, than education, etc. But still, it remains nevertheless in an important difference. Equally, one here could argue that actually comparing or including or controlling for education an income may be including for bad controls, because it perhaps the effect of city on progressive values happens through factors such as education, but here it's open for discussion. So far, so to recap the first part, I hope to have convinced you that there are significant urban-rural differences in progressive values around the world. But let's try to answer the second question. So, does this gap difference differ across a group of countries? In fact, as I had anticipated, our theory or our expectation is that this difference will be more pronounced in places which have achieved a higher economic affluence. And to test this hypothesis, we split the results into three groups: high income, upper middle income, and lower middle income. And we find that the gap is higher in the high income countries, as we have expected. It becomes somehow smaller in middle income countries and becomes even smaller and almost insignificant in low income countries. Just as a note here, I'm presenting the results stratifying, that is, dividing the three groups of countries in different regressions when we run these results, including an interaction with between country income and place of residence, the results are very similar. So to conclude, we also seem to find evidence with respect to our second hypothesis. And there seem to be, in fact, evidence supporting the idea that the differences between cities and the rest of the countryside tend to become more significant or more acute the higher a country or the is in terms of economic income. Since we are presenting to a Latin American audience, you may be asking me, well, so how does South America compare to the full global sample? And here are the results. The results are for the countries which I had highlighted earlier on. So Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. And somehow they are quite similar to our overall picture. The coefficients are slightly smaller, perhaps in line with our conceptual expectations. Most of these Latin American countries, in fact, are in the middle income level of development, with the exception of Chile, which is in the high income country in our dataset. So somehow there seemed to be a confirmation of our findings. You may equally be curious to see how the results compare when comparing different variables. And here I'm plotting again the global results on the left with South America on the right. Again, relatively similar, and perhaps the slight difference that in South America, the level of education or higher education in particular seem to be to play an even bigger role in influencing or in linking or in determining progressive values than across the globe. Similarly, since this is a seminar hosted by Chile, you may ask about Chile. And Chile is an interesting case because somehow when we plot the results on Chile, we don't find strong evidence in favor of a very neat urban-rural divide in values. Chile, as I anticipated, is a high-income country, so we would have expected to find a stronger coefficients, but we do find somehow some differences especially between small areas. But then there is something that perhaps we can discuss during the Q&A. For example, for small towns, which seem to go against our theory. So is perhaps, and this is food for thought, I'm happy to come back during the Q&A, Chile may be an outlier with respect to the global findings that we find in our research. To sum up, and here I conclude my presentation, in this paper we find that there is a significant gap in progressive values between cities, especially large cities, and smaller towns or rural areas, and with rural places being more conservative on all our dimensions of values that we analyze. We equally find, with the exception perhaps of Chile, that the gap is larger in high-income countries on average across the world. And last but not least, we find that the geographical dimension is, so geographical differences tend to be smaller perhaps than compositional effects, but nevertheless, geographical differences linked to city size remain substantial. With this, I conclude. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion or for questions.
Thank you, Davide, for your fascinating presentation. I would like to start the discussion. In Chile, we are a highly urbanized country. Probably, I think that is currently around 89% of people live in urban areas. So I think like much more, essentially, because we are almost fully urbanized. But I am quite interested about that you made about scarcity and income, in the sense that the economic situation of a country is not necessarily stable, right? We have essentially received a massive shock during the COVID pandemic, and that means for many countries a regression in their economic status, as essentially losing somehow what if you want is a positive way of thinking about society that we always value. So I guess my question is about how do you perceive that rather than increasing the economic situation, the decrease of or the deterioration of the economic situation of a country may change how people think about progressive values, and if that somehow could create the basis for maybe studying some causal claims, checking that as random shocks.
Yeah. By the way, let me also introduce Javier and Jonas, who are just tuned in, and they are my co-authors, and they are welcome to jump in. So first of all, your question highlights 2 points. The first one is that Chile perhaps is in a unique position in our data set, in the sense that most of the population, as you highlight, is urban. And this might explain the low differences that we find in our results for Chile, the ones I presented today. Or somehow the strange coefficients for one of the categories. In a sense, we still find that, for example, very rural areas tend to be lagging behind in terms of progressive values, but we find something strange for middle categories, which might explain might be in line with what you suggest. The second point, in a sense, that the categorization based on the country income is, of course, is a very crude one, if we want, no? In a sense that the theory, our underlying theory tells us that it's not that the country level of income, but it's the individual level of a self-security. So connecting to your question, one would need to check for perhaps for the individual level of security and insecurity. And in fact, in our, let me share again the screen, in our, hoping that you can see, let me open it again. Okay, well, it's not working, but basically in our analysis, we control for individual income, and we do see that, in fact, the individual income has a very strong effect, as much as education, or slightly less than education, but has a significant effect also, or a significant link with outcomes. So going back to your question, one need to console for the personal income. Perhaps your question points to something that with our current data we can do, but would be interesting in the future to see whether the shock caused by COVID may trigger a change in value. So if that's really, that perhaps could be the proof of our theory. If there is a causal shock and so a reversing of this link between personal material welfare and values.
And another question that I think, so Mariela is asking here in the chat, is that if you have considered inequality among countries, and I think related with that is that cities in Latin America, particularly, are characterized for being quite segregated, socioeconomically, racially, and so on. So maybe some of the hypotheses that you are putting forward as cities as the melting pot for different lifestyles in kind of very segregated city where people live and work around different neighborhoods may be part of an accomplished type of interaction between different classes, sexual diversity, and family values.
Yeah, so this is a fascinating point, in a sense that well, both fascinating points. The inequalities between countries, we don't consider that, in a sense that we don't see, and we are very happy to be challenged, Mariella. If you have any thoughts on what could be the link between inequality within countries and our outcomes. There is, of course, a big point with inequality within countries and the effect of a segregation, and especially urban segregation. We should, in a way, challenge our theory. Absolutely, that's a fascinating point. Perhaps my response to that is that even when we consider South America and the results that I showed you earlier in the slides, we do find some significant differences between cities and the countryside. So perhaps there might be a factor playing against our story, but in spite of that, we still find important differences in cities with respect to the rest of the country, even in South America, where social segregation is very high and potentially cities become less of a beacon for interaction between groups. Yeah, this is my answer.
Thank you, David. I don't know if I can. I just stopped.
Mariella.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Go ahead, Mariella.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much for your stimulating presentation. Yes, I meant within countries, as you said, because I just wrote among countries, but it was within countries because, for me is, I am really uncomfortable with the fact that Chile is considered a high income country because we have huge inequalities. I think that, if you so yeah, of course, because you are talking about conservative, yeah, within places where there is maybe less education, but yeah, no, I don't have any study about that. I just I find the and no, it was just that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just to follow up on this, absolutely. So then, thanks for the comment. In a sense, as I was saying earlier, the fact that we still find effects or differences between cities and the countryside, even taking into account these very high inequalities, is telling us something of the story that we are thinking about. In a way, what you are both thinking is about inequalities is a sort of confounding factor. And one perhaps might also need to be realistic about how the different parts of our progressive values may play in different ways. So I'm thinking about, to an anecdote. I have some friends from very affluent parts of urban cities in Latin America. But this could apply to other friends from other places. And they will score very high in progressive values. They're very progressive towards a set of issues, even if they come from this very unequal and very segregated system. And probably on the economic factors, they will be very non-progressive. If they were interviewed and say, well, do you want to go for redistribution? They will say, no, we like the inequalities because we want. And they will probably be part of the status quo that you highlight about the inequalities, but still will score high on progressive value. So perhaps there is some sort of idiosyncratic dimensions of different aspects of what we mean, we identify as progressive in terms of cultural attitudes with respect to, let's say, economic redistribution issues. But perhaps it would open up a very different research ideas, and this is absolutely very relevant. And it's a point taken that we need to highlight the relevance of this point. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have another comment related with you spoke essentially, and the paper is essentially about material security. But for instance, there are other frameworks like a Maslow pyramid of priorities, like primary priorities, secondary, And on the third level, but I am thinking about security, like physical security, is something that potentially it can explain, like not only high income countries, but some variation on middle income and low income countries, where the issue of security, this primary level of survival, feeling safe, I don't know, I think it plays a big role. And where you see as well in countries such as Brazil with the rise of Bolsonaro, or recently in Chile with we have a presidential election next week, and there is a candidate that is essentially bringing a lot of votes, essentially exploiting conservatism on family values, regression on gender, and a strong anti-migration policy. So as well, because probably the recent political stability and that we are living in the country and the sensation of uncertainty. So how do you see that it could play a role, this essential, first of all, uncertitude, and second, this perception of safety, but much more as a physical, like the traditional perception of security?
Yeah, thanks. It's another fascinating point, in the sense that it's true that another way to go through our stratification of countries could be based on index of safety and security, as opposed to income, average country income. In a way, we guess average country income is a good proxy for level, but we totally agree that it's not a perfect proxy. One could, in fact, think, and we may try to do it to do an analysis where we divide the country groups into based on sort of a safety measures. With respect to your other point on elections, in a way, what we try to explore is within each country or within each average level of conservatism, whether there is a difference between cities and the countries. But this doesn't, so even if we find that there is a strong difference, the difference may be variating depending on the average level of the country. So you may consider that in countries such as perhaps in Chile today, or I'm thinking about France, or perhaps even Italy in the last years, there might be a growing rise of populism or conservatism, and we don't capture this in our analysis, because in a way this is somehow absorbed, technically speaking, our analysis, but doesn't tell on the average level if the country goes up. In a way, our theory will tell us that within this average level, which may go up or down, or conservative values, cities will still be the places where you are more likely to find a sort of progressive attitudes with respect to the average mean.
Great, and I think that all of the fascinating points that you make is when you start comparing the effect of this rural-urban divide compared with other dimensions. And I think that the one fascinating one that you have is the one of gender, that potentially the rural-urban divide could be similar to the one of gender. And the other one is the one on age, essentially, that representing two. So if you think like in rough terms, the difference between young generations and the grandparents is the same division between rural and urban divide, which I think is quite fascinating way of setting the results. I don't know if you have any other of these interesting comparisons that you would like to bring forward.
Yeah, well, thanks. It's I would say Javier has the merit of having developed this way of comparing the results. I guess another interesting and perhaps even more striking difference is the one with education, as the graphs were showing. And here I would perhaps leave the room for Javier and Jonas, if you want to add something on this, in a sense that
just two brief points before that, if you don't mind, because I was going to jump just before to introduce the other topic, but just regarding what we were discussing about income as a choice instead of security, for instance, one of the, well, I wouldn't say problems, but one of the major discussions that we have also among ourselves and that go in the paper is whether income is that right measure. And we can also consider other measures such as an index of democracy, for instance, to what extent people that are in democratic regimes, they have more freedom to associate themselves, they are less oppressed, let's say, by an authoritarian state, and that also influence the way they're thinking. So it's clearly not, and I think that should be very, it's clearly something that needs to be further developed to really understand whether this income dimension is the primarily one or whether there are other dimensions. But we think that overall, if we take income, there might be probably a high correlation between income and democratic freedoms, and as well as security. So in that sense, it's a safe choice. In terms of the comparisons, I think that as you were saying, for me, the most striking one was the generational one, because it can really show, a generation of change is a lot. I mean, it's true that the education one as well is important, but in the education we have different categories, so it's always perhaps harder to visualize, what is the difference between someone without education and someone, let's say, in primary or in secondary education. It's hard to conceptualize what it means. Whereas I think that when we take the generational gap, it's very easy to understand how our parents think or how our grandparents think vis-a-vis how we think, and I think that is a major as you were saying, a quite successful way of conceptualizing this.
I would like to ask you a question that comes from the chat. Jonas, you wanted to say something?
Oh yeah. Thank you. Just a quick comment. Thank you for a great presentation by David, and thank you for inviting us to Chile. It's my first time in Chile, so yeah. But I think what very valuable comments. But I just want to add just a bit about these country fixed effects, because I had the same experience when I presented at the seminar with some researchers in also international group. Researchers last week, is that with the country fixed effects, a lot of these things are taken into account, that there are differences in democracies and welfare states and institutions that might influence. So despite controlling all of that, and the divide of income, as Javier told you guys about, it's also in line with the Inglehart theory. So it's all about modernization, because there's some relationship between economic development and modernization. So that's why we have ended up using that. But of course, there are things that we might need to discuss, etc. But I think it's very fascinating to find this urban-rural gap so clear and across countries, albeit with some variation. And once again, thank you for inviting us. Thanks.
Great, thank you, John. I have another question here in the chat, essentially, and it's a methodological question. I know that you work mainly on quantitative research, and one of the fascinating things about the research is as you put on the paper, is kind of representing half of the world population through these all collected data set. But how do you envision or if you think that may have any role doing qualitative research to trying to maybe bring some different explanations or different understanding of the mechanisms to use it?
Yeah, well, fascinating question. Let me say that our goal specifically here was to create a sort of framework, a cross-country framework of results, or sort of a conceptual framework for other more in-depth studies to be built. we are definitely in favor of a qualitative research. In fact, we, especially on mixed methods. In a way, we decided not to go for a mixed method approach in this specific paper is that it would be too broad. In a sense, our goal was to create this cross-country data set, cross-country picture in which then individual countries, and we saw the case of Chile from the pictures, the slides I showed. Chile, for example, is a sort of idiosyncratic case, perhaps compared to the global picture, and that's the kind of individual countries may have, where also qualitative research may fit in. So the answer is we would love to include it perhaps in the next step or in the next project, or perhaps if other teams would like to take on this message and develop it further.
Great.
Xavier, I see that your mic was open. I don't know if you wanted to add something. Okay, perfect.
Okay, just a follow-up question. How you know that there are other research that essentially, or other indicators at the country level that measure kind of, rather than attitudes, like individual attitudes, they measure objective change, you know? So kind of, if there is a law of abortion, if divorce is something that people can do, and so on. So do you think that there is a way of factoring in, or if you want, how they align what people think with what the country actually reflects as progressive law and a progressive environment?
So in a way, this point to the point we were making earlier on country differences and what Jonas was saying in his answer. In a way, technically speaking, this idiosyncratic, so country unique differences are captured in the analysis by the inclusion of country fixed effects. One might consider whether this is interesting to study beyond. So in standard regressions, we don't analyze or consider the fixed effects. One could think that actually that may be relevant and worthwhile studying, perhaps. Yes. But for simplicity, we need to focus and prioritize some measures in the paper, in the story, and we focus on the other. And this connects to the other point. It says the value of what we do here is to provide a cross-country comparison, including 60 countries, that is to say all close to half of the global population. And if you want to do that, I mean, any researcher will be aware that it's difficult to find metrics and variables that are consistent across countries. And that's why we focus on this value survey as opposed to going to some more, perhaps more meaningful measures, but then are difficult to compare. So in a way, we struck a balance between detail and the cross-country breadth of the study, which is what we think is our contribution.
And
also, I think it's important.
Go ahead.
No, I was saying that I think it's important to notice that if you wanted to do something that looks more into, well, basically the country fixed effects that we're just using for absorbing the regression, but what are the differences, let's say, across countries when we, well, let's say that we were able to have an index of how these issues are regulated, and we would want to see how the regulation of certain issues affect the way a country think about those issues. One of the problems that you would encounter is that the number of observations that we have in the world is unfortunately limited. So the number of countries that we have in the world is unfortunately limited, and therefore many of it would be very difficult to arrive to, I would say, meaningful, significant results. And I think that's basically one of the pities of the world with everything, because you would want to do this sort of analysis if you had way more countries, but unfortunately many of the regulations and only change at the country level. So that makes the analysis complex.
Yeah, just to end up, we are almost on time. A very short question. You mentioned that in the paper you cannot essentially solve the problem of sorting. You know, like highly educated people move to cities, and that could be part of the explanation. have you figured out, or do you have any research project that potentially could get rid of that sorting effect? Maybe not at an international level, but maybe on a smaller scale.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. In a way, somehow in the paper, we do control for sorting based on observable characteristics. So we are able to control for sorting effects based, for example, on education or income, on gender, etc., on this kind of observable individual characteristics. So we already do, we think and believe, a good job in control for sorting. Having said that, of course, one could think about sorting based on unobservable traits, such as cognitive attitudes, cognitive thoughts, intrinsic underpinnings, etc., which we can measure. In a way to control for that, personally, with another team, we are doing a project where we basically track down people, so individual people over time, and moving in and out of cities. And so in a way, we are able to include individual people fixed effects. That is to say, we are able to include or to knit out these individual unobservable and unmeasurable characteristics. And so in a way, we can find a more causal discussion of sorting mechanism. Just to anticipate, the results tend to be very similar. We tend always to find a very strong difference or a strong contextual effects of cities on individual behaviors.
Great.
Or individual attitudes.
So living together makes you think more progressively.
In a way, yes.
And really the final question, and I need you to go very fast over it. Any policy implication to make a more inclusive world from the paper?
So it's this is perhaps the $1 million question, in the sense that the modernization theory and the work by Engelhardt will tell us that making sure that everyone feels safe, so feels that their needs are addressed, their basic needs, which could be like addressing basic economic needs, but also issue of safety is the key to make people more progressive. So in a way, I will link it to a progressive policy recipe where we want people, and we don't want only country average levels of income, but we want individual people in cities. For example, let's think about slums and difference and inequality. So we will say this is our findings highlight the importance of a progressive, also on the economic side, recipes and progressive policies.
Great.
Yeah.
On that note, that probably people need to feel safe and solve primary needs before thinking about inclusion and solving the other issues. I would like to thank you, Davide, Javier, and Jonas, for being here today. It has been an amazing presentation for us at the Institute of How to Hear. And I will share with you later the presentation. And for everyone that is following this presentation, I would like to thank you for attending and following it and giving us questions. We meet up in 2 weeks for the presentation of Paula Giron here to the final session that we have here at the Global Habitat Seminar. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks.